Welcome to this chapter by chapter reading of the Montessori Method by Dr. Maria Montessori. When I was starting my Montessori school, I turned directly to Dr. Montessori's original writings, partly out of conviction and partly because they were available in the public domain and free. What I didn't realize at the time was I was reading the original English translation commissioned while Dr. Montessori was still alive, translated in 1912 by Anne E. George. Later, I discovered that many of us have encountered Montessori through later translations, especially the 1967 version, which helped spread the method widely in the US, and for which I'm personally grateful. But returning to the original text, I found something more: Dr. Montessori's full voice, her depth, her vision, and her spiritual and philosophical foundations. In this podcast, I'm reading the original translation chapter by chapter, adding reflections to help connect her words to today's classrooms and families. This is an experiment, an adventure, and a shared journey of learning. Let's begin. Welcome to the next reading of the Montessori Method. We are reading today Chapter 9, Muscular Education, Gymnastics. My name is Melissa Rohan, and I am the founder and head of school here at Waterfront Academy. And if you are just tuning in, we are reading chapter by chapter the 1912 translation of Dr. Montessori's Montessori Method. She wrote it originally in 1909 and then commissioned this translation by Anne E. George. And this is how largely her work was introduced here in the United States. It was then rewritten in 1967, and that's the translation that most of us have read of the Montessori Method. But there are some liberties that were taken in that one. It's not really a criticism because I owe a debt of gratitude for it, but I think that it's really great to have the opportunity to read what the original intention was with this book and this work of Dr. Montessori's. So with that, let's go ahead and get started on some of the big talking points and reflections on Chapter 9. So she talks a lot about how the sensitive period of movement is between the ages of 3 to 6. She said if there was an ideal time, this would be it to learn how to run and jump and walk and breathe. She also talks about this as the perfect time to learn how to dress themselves, acts of daily life is what she calls it. Dress themselves, undress themselves, tie their shoelaces, things like that. So it's really for gross and fine motor development. And really, we know now that, quite frankly, walking for young toddlers is truly just a miracle. It's very divine in the way it works because physically, they're not, their physical body isn't meant for walking. Their head is so big and heavy compared to the rest of their body. And so the proportions are completely off. So their center of gravity is not where it should be. And so they just kind of fall from step to step. I'm sure now you're thinking about it. You're like, oh yeah, I mean, this is something you can observe. You just fall from one step to the next. And really it's really walking emerges from courage and repetition and trust in the body. So mechanically, it just wouldn't really work. So it's quite divine, actually, remarkable. So movement is not just about exercise in the modern gym class sense. It is about intelligent expressing itself through coordinated movement. So it's very purposeful actions. Like I said, walking, carrying things, fastening things, And she, in this chapter, introduces one of those iconic lessons that you would find in a primary class, walking on the line. And she also introduced some iconic materials like the dressing frame, for example. And she refers back to, again, like we've discussed in previous chapters, care of the animals and gardening. So these are really kind of the big themes in this chapter. Oh, also she really talks about working with the children on pronunciation, breathing, and speech. These are really important in this particular chapter. And so this is kind of the chapter 9, hopefully. So let's go ahead and get started in the reading of chapter 9, Muscular Education, Gymnastics. The generally accepted idea of gymnastics is, I consider, very inadequate. In the common schools, we are accustomed to describe as gymnastics a species of collective muscular discipline which has as its aim that children shall learn to follow definite ordered movements given in the form of commands. The guiding spirit in such gymnastics is coercion, and I feel that such exercises repress spontaneous movements and impose others in their place. I do not know what the psychological authority for the selection of these imposed movements is. Similar movements are used in medical gymnastics in order to restore a normal movement to a torpid muscle or to give back a normal movement to a paralyzed muscle. A number of chest movements which are given in the school are advised, for example, in medicine for those who suffer from intestinal torpidity. But truly, I do not well understand what office such exercises can fulfill when they are followed by squadrons of normal children. In addition to these formal gymnastics, we have those which are carried on in a gymnasium and which are very like the first steps in the training of an acrobat. However, this is not the place for criticism of the gymnastics used in our common schools. Certainly in our case, we are not considering such gymnastics. Indeed, many who hear me speak of gymnastics for infant schools very plainly show disapprobation, and they will disapprove more heartily when they hear me speak of gymnasium for little children. Indeed, if the gymnastic exercises and the gymnasium were those of the common schools, no one would agree more heartily than I in the disapproval expressed by these critics. We must understand by gymnastics, and in general by muscular education, a series of exercises tending to aid the normal development of psychological movements, such as walking, breathing, speech, to protect this development when the child shows himself backward or abnormal in any way, and to encourage in the children those movements which are useful in the achievement of the most ordinary acts of life, such as dressing, undressing, buttoning the clothes, lacing their shoes, carrying such objects as balls, cubes, etc., if there exists an age in which it is necessary to protect a child by means of a series of gymnastic exercises between 3 and 6 years is undoubtedly the age. The specific gymnastics necessary, or better still, hygienic, in this period of life refer chiefly to walking. A child in the general morphology growth of his body is characterized by having a torso greatly developed in comparison with the lower limbs. In the newborn child, the length of the torso from the top of the head to the curve of the groin is equal to 68% of the total length of the body. The limbs then are barely 32% of the stature. During growth, these relative proportions change in a most noticeable way. Thus, for example, in the adult, the torso is fully half of the entire stature, and according to the individual corresponds to 51 or 52% of it. The more morphological difference between the newborn child and the adult is bridged so slowly during growth that in the first years of the child's life, the torso still remains tremendously developed as compared with the limbs. In 1 year, the height of the torso corresponds to 65% of the total stature. In 2 years to 63, and in 3 years to 62. At the age when a child enters the infant school, his limbs are still very short as compared with his torso. That is, the length of his limbs barely corresponds to 38% of the stature. Between the years of 6 and 7, the proportion of the torso to the stature is from 57 to 56%. In such a period, therefore, the child not only makes a noticeable growth in height, he measures indeed at the age of 3 years about 0.85 meter, and at 6 years 1.05 meters. But changing so greatly the relative proportions between the torso and the limbs, the latter make a most decided growth. This growth is related to the layers of cartilage which still exist at the extremity of the long bones, and is related in general to still incomplete ossification of the entire skeleton. The tender bones of the limbs must therefore sustain the weight of the torso, which is then disproportionately large. We cannot, if we consider all these things, judge the manner of walking in little children by the standards set for our own equilibrium. If a child is not strong, the erect posture and walking are really sources of fatigue for him, and the long bones of the lower limbs, yielding to the weight of the body, easily become deformed and usually bowed. This is particularly the case among the badly nourished children of the poor, or among those in whom the skeleton structure, while not actually showing the presence of rickets, still seems to be slow in attaining normal ossification. We are wrong, then, if we consider little children from this physical point of view as little men. They have instead characteristics and proportions that are entirely special to their age, and tendency of the child to stretch out on his back and kick his legs in the air is an expression of physical needs related to the proportions of his body. The baby loves to walk on all fours just because, like the quadruped animals, his limbs are short in comparison with his body. Instead of this, we divert these natural manifestations by foolish habits which are imposed on the child. We hinder him from throwing himself on the earth, from stretching, etc., and we oblige him to walk with grown people and to keep up with them, and excuse ourselves by saying that we don't want him to become capricious and think he can do as he pleases. It is indeed a fatal error, and one that has made bow leg common among little children. It is well to enlighten the mothers on these important particulars of infants' hygiene. Now, we, with the gymnastics, can and indeed should help the children in this development by making our exercises correspond to the movement which he needs to make, and in this way save his limbs from fatigue. One very simple means by helping the child in this activity was suggested to me by my observation of the children themselves. The teacher was having the children march, leading them about the courtyard between the walls of the house and the central garden. This garden was protected by a little fence made of strong wires, which were stretched in parallel lines, and they were supported at intervals by wooden palings driven into the ground. Along the fence ran a little ledge on which the children were in the habit of sitting down when they were tired of marching. In addition to this, I always brought out little chairs, which I placed against the wall. Every now and then, the little ones of 2 and 1.5 and 3 years would drop out from the marching line, evidently being tired. But instead of sitting down on the ground or on the chairs, they would run to the little fence, and catching hold of the upper line of wire, they would walk along sideways, resting their feet on the wire which was nearest the ground. That this gave them a great deal of pleasure was evident from the way in which they laughed, as with bright eyes they watched their larger companions who were marching about. The truth was that these little ones had solved one of my problems in a very practical way. They moved themselves along on the wires, pulling their bodies sideways. In this way, they moved their limbs without throwing upon them the weight of their body. Such an apparatus placed in the gymnasium for little children will enable them to fulfill the need which they feel of throwing themselves on the floor and kicking their legs in the air, for the movements they make on the little fence correspond even more correctly to the same physical needs. Therefore, I advise the manufacturer of this little fence for use in children's playrooms. It can be constructed of parallel bars supported by upright poles firmly fixed on to the heavy base. The children, while playing upon this little fence, will be able to look out and see with great pleasure what the other children are doing in the room. Other pieces of gymnasium apparatus can be constructed upon the same plan, that is, having as their aim the furnishings of the child with the proper outlet for his individual activities. One of the things invented by Seguin to develop the lower limbs, and especially to strengthen the articulation of the knee in weak children, is the trampolino. This is a kind of swing having a very wide seat, so wide indeed that the limbs of the child stretched out in front of him are entirely supported by this broad seat. This little chair is hung from strong cords and is left swinging, the wall in front of it reinforced by a strong, smooth board against which the children press their feet in pushing themselves back and forth in the swing. The child seated in this swing exercises his limbs, pressing his feet against the board each time that he swings towards the wall. The board against which he swings may be erected at some distance from the wall and may be so low that the child can see over the top of it as he swings in the chair. He strengthens his limbs through the species of gymnastics limited to the lower limbs, and he does without resting the weight of his body upon his legs. Another piece of gymnastic apparatus, less important from the hygienic standpoint, but very amusing to the children, may be described briefly. The pendulum, a game which may be played by one child or by several, consisting of rubber balls hung on a cord. The children, seated in their little armchairs, strike the ball, sending it from one to another. It is an exercise for the arms and for the spinal column, and is at the same time an exercise in which the eye gauges the distance of bodies and motions. Another game, called the cord, consists of a line drawn on the earth with chalk, along which the child walk. This helps to order and to direct their free movements in a given direction. A game like this is very pretty indeed after a snowfall, when the little path made by the children shows the regularity of the line they have traced, and encourages a pleasant war among them in which each one tries to make his line in the snow the most regular. The little round chair is another game, in which a little wooden stairway built on the plan of the spiral is used. This little stair is enclosed on one side by a balustrade on which the children can rest their hand. The other side is open and circular. This serves to habituate the children to climbing and descending stairs without holding on to the balustrade, and teaches them to move up and down with movements that are poised and self-controlled. The steps must be very low and very shallow. Going up on this little stair, the very smallest children can learn movements which they cannot follow properly in climbing ordinary stairways in their homes, in which the proportions are arranged for adults. Another piece of gymnasium apparatus, adapted for the broad jump, consists of a low wooden platform painted with various lines by means of which the distance jumped may be gauged. There is a small flight of stairs which may be used in connection with this plane, making it possible to practice to measure the high jump. I also believe that rope ladders may be so adapted as to be suitable for use in schools for little children. Used in pairs, these would, it seems to me, help to perfect a great variety of movements such as kneeling, rising, bending forward and backward, etc. Movements which the child, without the help of the ladder, could not make without losing his equilibrium. All of these movements are useful in that they help the child to acquire first equilibrium, then that coordination of the muscular movements necessary to him. They are, moreover, helpful in that they increase the chest expansion. Besides all this, such movements as I have described reinforces the hand in its most primitive and essential action, prehension, the movement which necessarily precedes all the finer movements of the hand itself. Such apparatus was successfully used by Seguin to develop the general strength and the movement of prehension in his idiotic children. The gymnasium, therefore, offers a field for the most varied exercises tending to establish the coordination of the movements common in life, such as walking, throwing objects, going up and down stairs, kneeling, rising, jumping, etc. Free gymnastics. By free gymnastics, I mean those which are given without any apparatus. Such gymnastics are divided into two classes, directed and required exercises, and free games. In the first class, I recommend the march, the object of which should not be rhythm, but poise only. When the march is introduced, it is well to accompany it with the singing of little songs, because this furnishes breathing exercise very helpful in strengthening the lungs. Besides the march, many of the games of Froebel, which are accompanied by song, very similar to those which the children constantly play among themselves, may be used. In the free games, we furnish the children with balls, hoops, beanbags, and kites. The trees readily offer themselves to the game of Pussy Wants a Corner and many simple games of tag. Educational gymnastics. Under the name of educational gymnastics, we include two series of exercises which really form a part of other schoolwork, as for instance, the cultivation of the earth and the care of plants and animals, watering and pruning the plants, carrying the grain to the chicken, etc. These activities call for various coordinated movements, as, for example, in hoeing, in getting down to plant things, and in rising. The trips which children make in carrying an object to some definite place and in making a definite practical use of these objects offer a field for very valuable gymnastic exercises. The scattering of minute objects such as corn and oats is valuable, and also the exercise of opening and closing the gates to the garden and to the chicken yard. All of these exercises are the more valuable in that they are carried on in the open air. Among our educational gymnastics, we have exercises to develop coordinated movements of the fingers, and these prepare the children for the exercises of practical life, such as dressing and undressing themselves. The didactic material from which the basis of the last means gymnastics is very simple, consisting of wooden frames, each mounted with two pieces of cloth or leather to be fastened and unfastened by means of the buttons and the buttonholes, hooks and eyes, eyelets and lacings, or automatic fastenings. In our children's house, we use 10 of these frames so constructed that each one of them illustrate a different process in dressing or undressing. 1. Mounted with heavy pieces of wool, which are to be fastened by means of large bone buttons, corresponds to children's dresses. 2. Mounted with pieces of linen to be fastened with pearl buttons, corresponds to a child's underwear. 3. Leather pieces mounted with shoe buttons. In fastening these leather pieces, the children make use of the button hook, corresponds to a child's shoes. 4. Pieces of leather which are laced together by means of eyelets and shoelaces. 5. 2 pieces of cloth to be laced together. These pieces are boned and therefore corresponds to the little bodices worn by the peasants in Italy. 6. 2 pieces of stuff to be fastened by means of large hooks and eyes. 7. 2 pieces of linen to be fastened by means of small hooks and worked eyelets. 8. 2 pieces of cloth to be fastened by means of broad colored ribbon, which is to be tied into bows. 9 pieces of cloth laced together with round cord on the same order as the fastening of many of the children's underclothes. 10 2 pieces of fastened together by means of the modern automatic fasteners. Through the use of such toys, the children can practically analyze the movements necessary in dressing and undressing themselves and can prepare themselves separately from these movements by means of repeated exercises. We succeeded in teaching the child to dress himself without his really being aware of it. That is, without any direct or arbitrary command, we have led him to this mastery. As soon as he knows how to do it, he begins to wish to make a practical application of his ability, and very soon he will be proud of being sufficient unto himself and will take delight in the ability which makes his body free from the hands of others and which leads him the sooner to that modesty and activity which develops far too late in those children of today who are deprived of this most practical form of education. The fastening games are very pleasing to the little ones, and often when 10 of them are using the frames at the same time, seated around the little tables, quiet and serious, they give the impression of a workroom filled with tiny workers. Respiratory gymnastics. The purpose of these gymnastics is to regulate the respiratory movements. In other words, to teach the art of breathing. They also help greatly the correct formation of the child's speech habits. The exercises which we use were introduced into the school literature by Professor Sala. We have chosen the simple exercises described by him in his treatise, Cura della Balbuzi. These include a number of respiratory gymnastic exercises with which are coordinated muscular exercises. I give here an example. Mouth wide open, tongue held flat, hands on hips. Breathe deeply, lift the shoulders rapidly, lowering the diaphragm. Expel breath slowly, lowering shoulders slowly, returning to normal position. The directress should select or devise simple breathing exercises to be accompanied with arm movements, etc. Exercises for proper use of lips, tongue, and teeth. These exercises teaches the movements of the lips and tongue in the pronunciation of certain fundamental consonant sounds, reinforcing the muscles and making them ready for these movements. These gymnastics prepare the organs used in the formation of language. In presenting such exercises, we begin with the entire class, but finish by testing the children individually. We ask the child to pronounce out loud and with force the first syllable of a word. When all are intent upon putting the greatest possible force into this, we call each child separately and have him repeat the word. If he pronounces it correctly, we send him to the right, if badly, to the left. Those who have difficulty with the word are then encouraged to repeat it several times. The teacher takes note of the age of the child and of the particular defects in the movement of the muscles he used in articulating. She then may touch the muscle which should be used, tapping, for example, the curve of the lips, or even taking hold of the child's tongue and placing it against the dental arch, or showing him clearly the movements which she herself makes when pronouncing the syllable. She must seek in every way to aid the normal development of the movements necessary to the exact articulation of the word. As the basis for these gymnastics, we have the children pronounce the words pene, fame, tene, Zena, Stella, Reina, and Gatto. In the pronunciation of pene, the children should repeat with much force, pa, 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 thus exercising the muscles, producing a peculiar contraction of the lips. In Feme, repeating fa, 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 the children exercises the movement of the lower lip against the upper dental arch. In Tana, having them repeat ta, 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 we cause him to exercise the movement of the tongue against the upper dental arch. In Zena, we provoke the contract of the upper and lower dental arches. With Stella, we have him repeat the whole word, bringing the teeth together and holding the tongue, which has a tendency to protrude, close against the upper teeth. In Reina, we have the repeat thus exercising the tongue in the vibratory movements. And Gato, we hold the voice upon the guttural. That concludes this chapter of the Montessori Method. Thank you for listening and for taking part in this journey with me. This project is very much an exploration. If you have thoughts to add, questions to ask, or if you think I misunderstood or missed something important, I genuinely want to hear from you. Please message me, share your reflections, or continue the conversation with fellow listeners. On a quest to learning, relearning, and engaging deeply with Dr. Montessori's work as we go. Join me next time as we continue chapter by chapter.